"Nobody move. Put the money in the bag and don't be heroes," I shouted, waving a matte black plastic pistol at a potted ficus. I sounded less like a seasoned criminal and more like a stressed substitute teacher. Beside me, Conrad adjusted the cuffs of his bespoke charcoal suit, looking utterly bored. He didn't even have his mask on. He just stood in the center of the bank lobby like he owned the marble beneath his shoes. "Cleo," he murmured, his tone entirely too calm for a felony. "You're threatening the foliage." "I'm improvising," I hissed, lowering the rubber toy. "Watch the door." Behind the glass partition, a teller's hand crept toward the silent alarm. Conrad caught the movement. He didn't pull a weapon. He simply turned his head, his jaw ticking, and released a sound that shouldn't have come from a human chest. Everybody down. It wasn't a shout. It was a physical shockwave. The terrifying acoustic force hit the room like a localized earthquake. The effect was immediate. The teller vanished. The security guard face-planted into a velvet rope. A pizza delivery guy dropped his box and curled into a ball. Even a golden retriever waiting by the ATMs flattened itself against the tiles, paws over its snout. I stared in horrified awe. Conrad stepped over the softly snoring guard, strolled into the open vault, and completely bypassed millions in bundled cash. He walked back holding a single, blindingly brilliant diamond necklace. He stopped in front of me, brushing my hair aside. "Yours, my lady," he whispered, fastening the heavy platinum around my throat. Chapter 1. 3 days earlier, the only thing I was plotting to assassinate was a stubborn patch of mildew near the fertilizer bags. My flower shop, Petal and Wreck, was a humid, chaotic jungle of overgrown ferns and dying dreams. I wiped a streak of potting soil across my forehead, gripping my battered push-broom like a battle axe. The bank was circling. The foreclosure notices were piling up in the cash register drawer. If I didn't find a miracle by Friday, the massive financial empire buying up the block was going to pave over my grandmother's legacy for a parking garage. The brass bell above the door jingled. I didn't look up, aggressively attacking the floorboards. "We're closed. Unless you're delivering a miracle or a cashier's check, turn around." Nobody turned around. Instead, the stifling air inside the shop instantly shifted. The scent of damp earth and crushed petals was suddenly swallowed whole by something sharp, expensive, and devastatingly cold. Like ozone right before a lightning strike, I straightened up, ready to bark another warning, and the words died in my throat. He took up entirely too much space. The man standing in my doorway wasn't just tall. He was an architectural event. He wore a razor-sharp, bespoke charcoal suit that probably cost more than my entire inventory. Behind him hovered 2 nervous-looking men in cheaper suits, clutching leather portfolios. Lawyers. The vultures had arrived early. "Are you the proprietor of this establishment?" one of the lackeys asked, eyeing a trailing pothos plant with open disgust. I gripped the broom handle tighter. "Who wants to know?" The giant in the charcoal suit stepped forward. He didn't speak. He just stopped dead in his tracks. His gaze locked onto me, and every muscle in his massive frame went completely unnervingly rigid. His eyes, a startling, piercing amber, widened a fraction. I watched his chest rise in a slow, deep inhale, and then he simply froze. Not a single flinch, not a blink. Just a towering monument of a man staring at me like I had just materialized out of thin air. I waited for the corporate threat. I waited for the eviction notice. Nothing. "Excuse me," I snapped, waving a hand in front of my face. "Did your operating system crash? Or are you just here to stare at a woman going bankrupt?" The lawyers exchanged panicked glances. "Mr. Voss?" one whispered. "These acquisition papers?" Conrad Voss, the billionaire CEO of the conglomerate swallowing my life, the man who ruthlessly dismantled businesses before lunch. And right now he was standing in my doorway, looking completely and utterly paralyzed. "Mr. Voss?" The lawyer tried again, nudging his boss's elbow. Conrad didn't even blink. He just kept staring at my face, his jaw locked so tight I thought I heard a molar crack. I wasn't doing this. I wasn't going to let some arrogant, silent billionaire intimidate me in my own sanctuary. The panic of losing the shop flared into raw, defensive anger. "Right. I see how it is," I muttered, flipping the push-broom around. You think you can just march in here, play the silent intimidation game, and I'll just hand over the keys? Get out. I shoved the bristled end of the broom directly against the toes of his polished leather Oxfords. Conrad looked down at the dirty bristles, then back up at my face, looking genuinely bewildered. Out! I yelled, pushing the broom harder against his shins. To the absolute horror of his legal team, the ruthless titan of industry took a stumbling step backward. "Ma'am, you cannot assault Mr. Voss with cleaning supplies," a lawyer squeaked. "Watch me." I shoved again. Conrad didn't say a word. He didn't fight back. The most feared man in Chicago's financial district just allowed a 5-foot florist to sweep him backward. I pushed him right past the threshold. "And don't come back without a warrant," I shouted, giving one final aggressive thrust. Conrad Voss stumbled backward off the curb, his expensive shoes splashing directly into a murky, ankle-deep puddle. The icy rainwater splattered up his pristine trousers. He stood there in the muddy water, rain beginning to drizzle on his perfect hair, staring at me with those intense, unblinking amber eyes as his brain entirely short-circuited. I slammed the door and flipped the deadbolt.
Chapter 2. The 84th floor of the Voss Financial Tower was designed to be a sterile sensory vacuum, tempered glass, brushed steel, and climate-controlled air that smelled faintly of ozone and expensive cologne. For 300 years, I had cultivated environments exactly like this, spaces where logic reigned, where biological static was muted, and where the animal beneath my skin could be lulled into a dormant, manageable quiet. Today, the room was deafening. I sat at the head of the 20-foot mahogany conference table, my hands folded perfectly over my legal pad. On the projector screen behind me, a multi-billion-dollar corporate acquisition was being finalized. My beta, Stro, was pacing near the window, methodically dismantling the opposing counsel's counteroffer with surgical precision. I didn't hear a single word he said. My heightened biology was completely, catastrophically short-circuiting. Every nerve ending in my body felt like it was humming at a dangerous high-frequency vibration. My chest was tight, my breathing shallow, and my shoes were wet. I stared blankly at the far wall, hyper-fixated on the damp cold seeping through my bespoke Italian leather Oxfords. I had been pushed into a puddle, me. The alpha of the Midwest Territory, a man who could crash the stock market with a phone call, had been physically swept out of a dilapidated flower shop by a human woman wielding a dirty push-broom, and my wolf was absolutely thrilled about it. I shifted in my leather chair, a low, involuntary rumble vibrating deep in my chest. The 3-pack executives sitting nearest to me instantly stiffened, their eyes dropping to the table in biological submission. "Mr. Voss?" Stro paused his presentation, sensing the violent shift in my pheromones. He adjusted his glasses, looking at me with mild concern. "Did you have an objection to the restructuring clause?" "The scent," I murmured, my voice coming out rougher, deeper than intended. Stro blinked. "Sir? The scent of the clause?" I didn't answer. I couldn't. I was suffocating on the phantom aroma of damp earth, crushed fern leaves, and the sharp, defiant spark of citrus. It was her, the florist, Cleo. Her scent was embedded in the fibers of my charcoal suit, overriding the sterile air of the boardroom. My ancient predatory instincts, which I had kept ruthlessly suppressed by spreadsheets and logic, had slammed into my prefrontal cortex the moment I crossed the threshold of her shop. Mate. The word was a biological imperative, a chemical lock clicking into place after centuries of empty rotation. She was angry, she was struggling, and she had looked at me not with the terror or reverence I was accustomed to, but with absolute unfiltered annoyance. I looked down at the mahogany table. Resting perfectly in the center of my blank legal pad was a single, slightly crushed daisy. It had hitched a ride on my sleeve when she assaulted me with the broom. I reached out, gently trapping the bruised white petals beneath my index finger. "Conrad," Stro tried again, abandoning the corporate formalities. His tone dropped an octave, shifting from my chief financial officer to my beta. "You are radiating heat. The windows are fogging. What is going on?" He was right. Condensation was creeping up the floor-to-ceiling glass of the boardroom. My core temperature was spiking, my body physically preparing for a claim, for a defense, for something that had absolutely nothing to do with corporate acquisitions. "Cancel it," I said flatly. The entire boardroom went dead silent. Opposing counsel dropped his pen. It clattered loudly against the wood. "Cancel. The merger?" Stroh asked, his voice carefully neutral. "Conrad, we are 20 minutes away from closing a $4 billion. "I don't care," I interrupted, standing up. The heavy leather chair slid backward. I carefully picked up the crushed daisy, tucking it into the breast pocket of my suit. "The acquisition is terminated. Clear my schedule for the rest of the week." I walked toward the glass double doors, ignoring the panicked murmurs of the executives. "Where are you going?" Stroh demanded, following me into the hallway. "I made a tactical error," I stated, pressing the elevator button. "I attempted to use real estate leverage on a biological anomaly. It was illogical." Stroh stared at me, completely lost. "What are you talking about?" "I need the complete financial file on the property located at 442 Elm Street," I ordered, stepping into the elevator. "Petal wreck. Find out who holds her debt. Find out who is threatening her. I want every single name on my desk in an hour." The doors began to close. "Conrad!" Stroh caught the door. "What is at that flower shop?" I looked at my beta, my amber eyes flashing brilliantly in the dim light of the elevator car. "My Luna."
Chapter 3: 48 hours violently aggressively repotting orchids. It was a coping mechanism. If my hands were covered in soil, I couldn't hold my phone to read the latest foreclosure warning from the bank. The humidity inside Petal and Rick was stifling, the air thick, with the heavy scent of blooming jasmine and my own impending doom. I wiped a layer of sweat off my forehead with the back of my canvas apron, glaring at a stubborn root system. "You're going to fit in this ceramic pot, or I am going to put you in the compost bin," I whispered to the orchid. "I am not taking any prisoners today." The brass bell above the door chimed, a cheerful, sharp sound that made every muscle in my neck snap tight. I turned around, fully expecting the sheriff with a padlock. Instead, it was the monolith. Conrad Voss stepped into my shop, closing the door quietly behind him. He wasn't flanked by nervous lawyers this time. He was completely alone, dressed in a black tailored dress shirt with no tie, the top 2 buttons undone. He looked less like a corporate executioner today and more like an apex predator, casually browsing a farmer's market. The moment he entered, the ambient temperature in the shop seemed to spike 10 degrees. The man radiated an abnormal, suffocating heat. "I told you," I said, gripping my plastic trowel like a weapon. "No warrant, no entry. I will get the broom." He didn't flinch. Those startling, unblinking amber eyes swept over me, taking in my messy bun, the dirt smudged across my cheek, the faded band tee under my apron. He looked at me with an intensity that felt less like observation and more like consumption. "I am not here to evict you," Conrad said. His voice was a low, resonant rumble that actually vibrated the glass wind chimes hanging above the register. "Then why are you here?" I snapped, stepping out from behind the counter. "Did you forget to insult my pothos plant on your way out last time?" He walked toward me, his movements incredibly fluid and silent for a man of his massive size. He stopped 3 feet away, pulling a sleek matte black credit card from his pocket. He placed it gently onto the wooden counter, next to a pile of loose soil. "I have recalculated my approach," Conrad stated smoothly. "I am here to purchase your inventory." I stared at the black card, then up at his perfectly carved, arrogant face. "My inventory, yes." He gestured vaguely at the jungle of greenery surrounding us. "All of it, every fern, every petal, every bag of fertilizer. Ring it up, name your price. I will ensure the funds clear immediately, giving you the liquid capital to satisfy your debt to the bank." I felt the blood drain from my face, quickly replaced by a hot, furious flush. He wasn't trying to evict me. He was trying to buy me. He saw my life's work, my grandmother's legacy, as a simple equation he could balance with his wallet. "You think," I started, my voice dangerously quiet, "you think you can just walk in here, throw a piece of plastic on my counter, and become my savior?" Conrad tilted his head, genuinely confused. It is a logical solution to your financial distress. You require capital. I possess an excess of it. Transaction complete. This isn't a transaction, I yelled, throwing my trowel onto the counter. This is my life. I don't want your pity money, and I don't need some emotionally stunted billionaire trying to fix my problems by buying my entire stock of hydrangeas. It is not pity, he said, his jaw tightening. It is provision. It's insulting. I was so angry I couldn't see straight. I reached blindly onto the display table next to me, grabbing the first thing my hand touched. I didn't care what it was. I just needed to throw something at his smug, perfectly symmetrical face. I lobbed it. Hard. It wasn't until the object was airborne that I realized I had just thrown a Parodia magnifica, a small, incredibly dense, heavy, and violently spiky ball cactus. Oh God, I thought, my anger instantly evaporating into panic. I just murdered a CEO. Conrad didn't even blink. He didn't duck. He didn't flinch. His hand snapped up with terrifying, inhuman speed. He caught the spiked cactus directly in the center of his palm, inches from his chest. The shop went dead silent. I stopped breathing. I stared at his massive hand, fully expecting blood to start dripping onto his expensive black shirt. Those thorns were an inch long and sharp as sewing needles. He slowly lowered his hand, holding the spiky green orb like it was a tennis ball. He looked down at it, then back up at me. There was no pain on his face, no blood, just a dark, heavy amusement swirling in his glowing eyes. Your defensive reflexes are admirable, he rumbled, stepping slowly toward me. He set the cactus gently onto the counter. But I do not bleed easily, Cleo. He knew my name. He leaned in, the sheer, unnatural heat of his body washing over me. I cannot buy your respect, he murmured, the realization sounding foreign on his tongue. Understood. Then I will have to earn it. Chapter 4. The Blind Tiger was the kind of underground speakeasy that required a password, a map, and a mild disregard for fire safety regulations. It smelled of old leather, expensive bourbon, and jazz that was played just a little too slow. It was supposed to be neutral ground. I sat in a curved velvet booth, acutely aware of how completely unneutral the situation actually felt. I had traded my dirty apron for a sharp black leather jacket and dark denim, trying to armor myself. It wasn't working. Conrad sat across from me, and he was taking up all the oxygen in the booth. He had stripped away the suit jacket, wearing a dark midnight blue button-down with the sleeves rolled up to his elbows. His forearms were corded with thick muscle and heavy veins, resting casually on the sticky table. He looked entirely out of place among the hipsters and jazz musicians, like a wolf lounging in a petting zoo. He had ordered my whiskey before I even sat down. "How did you know I drink bourbon?" I asked, eyeing the amber liquid suspiciously. "You smell of it," he replied deadpan, taking a sip from his own glass. Bourbon, vanilla, and damp earth. I frowned, sniffing my own leather sleeve. I do not smell like damp earth. I smell like a small business owner on the brink of a nervous breakdown. A faint, dangerous smirk pulled at the corner of his mouth. It was the first time I had seen him almost smile, and it did terrifying to my pulses. They are not mutually exclusive. I took a heavy gulp of the bourbon. It burned exactly the way I needed it to. "Look, Voss, you said you wanted to negotiate the lease. Let's negotiate. You can't buy my inventory, and you can't intimidate me. So what's your play?" He tapped his long fingers against his glass. "My plea is to understand why you are fighting a losing battle against the bank. The debt on your property is astronomical. It would be mathematically simpler to let Peddle and Wreck foreclose and start over elsewhere." "Mathematically simpler," I scoffed, rolling my eyes. "Do you run your whole life like a spreadsheet?" "Usually, yes," he admitted smoothly, "until recently." He looked at my mouth when he said it, and a sudden, sharp spike of heat flooded my chest. I quickly looked away, focusing on the ice melting in my glass. "It's not just the shop," I muttered, the fight suddenly draining out of me. The whiskey was loosening my tongue, lowering the defensive walls I had spent years building. "It's my grandmother's shop. And it's the collateral." Conrad stopped tapping his glass. His entire posture shifted, zeroing in on me with absolute predatory focus. "Explain." "When my grandmother got sick, she took out a desperate loan from the same bank you're partnered with. I said, tracing the rim of my glass. She put up her business, and she put up a family heirloom as collateral. A pearl and diamond necklace. It's been in our family for 4 generations. I let out a bitter, exhausted laugh. I finally scraped together enough to pay off that specific loan last week. I went to the bank manager, Phil, this smug weasel of a man, to get the necklace back. He told me it was misplaced during an audit. But the teller whispered to me that they didn't lose it. The bank quietly moved it into an unclaimed property auction that happens next month. They're going to sell my grandmother's necklace to some rich socialite, and legally, I can't prove a damn thing. I took another drink, staring at the scarred wooden table. So no, I'm not letting them take the shop too. I'm not letting those corporate thieves win. Silence stretched between us. It wasn't the uncomfortable, tense silence from the flower shop. It was heavy, dangerous. I finally looked up. Conrad was staring at me. The ambient light of the speakeasy caught his eyes, turning them a glowing, lethal amber. His jaw was locked tight, a muscle ticking violently near his ear. The heat radiating across the table was suddenly intense enough to make my palms sweat. "They stole from you," he rumbled. The words weren't a question. They were a death sentence. Technically, they exploited a loophole. I corrected weakly, suddenly terrified by the sheer violence simmering beneath his calm exterior. Conrad slowly leaned forward, invading my space entirely. He smelled of rain, spice, and absolute dominance. "Where is the necklace right now, Cleo?" "In the vault," I whispered, my heart hammering against my ribs. "At the main downtown branch. They hold the unclaimed auction items there." He held my gaze for a long, breathless moment. The billionaire CEO, the man who calculated everything down to the decimal point, was looking at me like I was the only variable that mattered. "Finish your drink," Conrad commanded softly, sliding out of the booth. "Why?" I asked, scrambling to grab my jacket as he stood up, his massive frame blocking out the light from the bar. He didn't look back as he walked toward the exit, his voice drifting over his shoulder with chilling, absolute certainty.
"Because tomorrow morning we are going to get it back." Chapter 5. The air in the alleyway behind the blind tiger tasted like damp brick and ozone. I scrambled out the heavy iron exit door, my boots hitting the wet asphalt as I tried to keep up with the monolith in the midnight blue shirt. The neon sign from the bar buzzed above us, casting long, fractured shadows across the puddles. "Voss, wait!" I called out, my voice echoing off the brick. "What do you mean, get it back? That's a highly secured financial institution. They have armed guards. They have cameras. They have a vault that probably requires a retinal scan and a blood sacrifice." Conrad didn't slow his stride. He approached a massive midnight black town car parked illegally next to a dumpster. It looked like a stealth bomber that had grown wheels. "Cameras can be wiped," he stated, his voice a low, unbothered hum over the distant city traffic. "And the vault operates on a standard biometric and dual-key redundancy system. It is heavily outdated." He stopped at the rear of the vehicle. The trunk popped open with a silent, expensive hiss. I crossed my arms, shivering as a gust of cold Chicago wind cut through my leather jacket. "Oh, I see, you're just going to call in a favor. Buy the branch manager a yacht and have him hand it over." "No," Conrad replied, staring down into the illuminated trunk. "That would leave a paper trail, and it would deprive you of the satisfaction." He reached past a neat stack of leather-bound legal briefs, a spare cashmere tie, and what looked suspiciously like a titanium crowbar. When his massive hand emerged, he turned around and held something out to me. I stared at it. I blinked. I looked up at his perfectly carved, utterly serious face, and then back down at his hand. "Is that—" I hesitated, my brain struggling to process the visual information. "Is that a toy gun?" "It is a highly realistic weighted polyurethane replica," Conrad corrected smoothly. "My security chief forced the executive board to participate in an active threat training seminar last quarter. I found it patronizing, so I confiscated the props." He pressed the cold rubber grip into my palm. It was heavy. It looked terrifyingly real. "You want me to rob a bank," I whispered, the sheer absurdity of the words scraping against my throat. With a piece of rubber. "I want you to reclaim stolen property," he countered, stepping closer. The casual distance between us vanished. He was suddenly right there, blocking out the neon lights, the alleyway, the entire city. The suffocating, radiating heat of his body enveloped me, cutting right through the chill of the rain. I had to tilt my head back to meet his eyes, those striking, unnatural amber irises glowing in the shadows. "You're insane," I breathed, my heart hammering a frantic, wild rhythm against my ribs. "You are a billionaire CEO. You could go to federal prison. I could go to federal prison." "I own the municipal zoning board, Cleo," he murmured, his gaze dropping to my mouth for a fraction of a second before snapping back up. "And I am highly invested in the outcome of this specific venture." "Why?" I demanded, the plastic gun heavy in my shaking hand. "Why would you risk everything for a florist you met 3 days ago?" He didn't offer a corporate excuse. He didn't blink. He just stared at me with an ancient, predatory focus that made the breath catch in my lungs. "Because you asked for a miracle," he rumbled, the sound vibrating deep in his chest. "And I do not like leaving you unanswered." He reached out, his long fingers gently brushing a stray, damp curl from my cheek. The contact was electric, a sharp shock of heat that made my pulse completely short-circuit. "Be ready at 8, Conrad commanded softly, turning to open the driver's side door. "Wear sensible shoes." Chapter 6. The fluorescent lights of Apex Outfitters were blindingly bright, illuminating racks of high-tech survival gear meant for people who climbed mountains, not people who argued with orchids for a living. I stood in front of a full-length mirror, adjusting the fit of a heavy black canvas tactical vest. I looked like a heavily armed crossing guard. "Absolutely not," Conrad's voice cut through the quiet hum of the store. I turned around. He was leaning against a display of titanium carabiners, arms crossed over a fresh, tailored black Henley that clung entirely too well to the broad expanse of his chest. He looked like an off-duty mercenary. I looked like a confused tourist. "What's wrong with this?" I asked, patting the stiff canvas. "It has pockets. Robbers love pockets." "You are not carrying loose change," he said, walking toward me. His movements were terrifyingly silent on the polished concrete floor. "And that material is highly reflective under security lighting. Take it off." "Fine," I huffed, unzipping the vest and tossing it onto a nearby bench. I grabbed a black and white striped knit shirt from a clearance rack and held it up to my chest. "How about this? I can pair it with a little black mask tied around my eyes. Really lean into the aesthetic." Conrad stopped 2 feet away, his expression dangerously flat. "I am not committing a felony with a cartoon burglar. Put the shirt down." "You have zero appreciation for the classics," I muttered, tossing the stripes aside. "I have an appreciation for operational security," he countered. He reached past me, the sheer heat of his body washing over my shoulders, and pulled a sleek, matte black leather jacket from a premium rack. It was cropped, entirely devoid of reflective hardware, and looked aggressively expensive. "Put this on," he ordered. I slipped my arms into the sleeves. It fit perfectly, molding to my shoulders like it had been tailored for me. I looked at myself in the mirror. With my dark jeans and combat boots, I actually looked dangerous. "Better," I admitted. Conrad stepped up directly behind me. I froze. My reflection in the glass was completely swallowed by his towering frame. I could see the hard line of his jaw hovering just above my shoulder, the intense, unblinking focus in his glowing eyes as he looked at us in the mirror. He reached around me, his massive hands brushing against my ribs as he gripped the front zipper of the jacket. The contact was light, but my entire body went rigid. Every nerve ending I possessed suddenly screamed to life. "The collar needs to remain up," he murmured, his voice a low, vibrating hum right beside my ear, "to obscure the jawline from the lateral cameras." He zipped the jacket up a few inches, his knuckles grazing the sensitive skin at the base of my throat. I swallowed hard. my breath hitching audibly in the quiet store. "Voss," I started, my voice betraying me with a breathless tremor. "Conrad," he corrected softly, his hands lingering on the leather collar. He didn't step back. He stayed right there, a wall of impossible heat and heavy muscle at my back. The air between us felt thick, charged with an electric tension that had absolutely nothing to do with bank blueprints or rubber guns. I couldn't look away from his reflection. He was staring at my mouth in the mirror, his pupils blown wide, swallowing the amber completely. "Conrad," I tried again, my hands gripping the edge of the display table to keep my knees from buckling. "Are we actually doing this?" He finally lifted his gaze to meet mine in the glass. The sheer possessive weight of his stare pinned me to the spot. "We are," he promised, his voice dropping into a rough primal register. "Let's go steal your legacy." Chapter 7. The Voss financial SUV was not a getaway car. It was a rolling fortress. I sat in the passenger seat, my knees pulled tightly together, clutching the rubber pistol in my lap like it was a live grenade. The engine idled with a barely perceptible purr. Outside the heavily tinted windows, the towering glass and steel facade of the downtown bank loomed like a fortress. It was 8:47 in the morning. 13 minutes until the doors opened to the public. "I'm going to throw up," I announced to the dashboard. "I'm going to throw up all over this very expensive, very soft leather." Conrad sat behind the steering wheel, radiating an infuriating amount of calm. He checked his heavy silver wristwatch, then methodically unbuttoned his cuffs, rolling the dark fabric up his forearms. "Your vitals are elevated, but you are not experiencing nausea," he stated, not even looking at me. "It is merely an adrenaline surge. Breathe." "Don't tell me to breathe. You can't logic away a felony, Conrad," I snapped, waving the plastic gun in the air. "We didn't even write a script. What do I say? Stick 'em up. Do people still say that?" He finally turned his head, leveling me with a look of profound exasperation. "If you say stick 'em up, I will personally escort you to the police station for crimes against dialogue." "Then what is the line?" I practically shrieked, the panic bubbling over. "I'm the one holding the plastic. You're just the terrifying muscle." "Keep it simple," he instructed, his tone steady, anchoring my spiraling anxiety. "Demand compliance. Secure the perimeter. Tell them to put the money in the bag." "We don't want the money," I argued, gripping the door handle. "We want the necklace. If I say put the money in the bag, they're going to give me money, and then we are actual thieves. I don't want to steal innocent people's money." Conrad blinked, processing my frantic logic. A muscle ticked in his jaw. "Fair point. Then simply demand the necklace." So I walk in and yell, "Give me the pearl and diamond heirloom from the unclaimed property auction of 1998. I threw my hands up in the air. That doesn't sound like a robbery. That sounds like an aggressive customer service dispute. Cleo. Maybe I should just ask to see Phil the manager and hit him with a heavy stapler. "Cleo!" He unbuckled his seatbelt and leaned across the massive center console. His hand wrapped around the back of my neck. The panic instantly died in my throat. His palm was scorching hot against my skin, his long fingers sliding into the hair at the nape of my neck with a firm, steadying pressure. The sheer weight of his touch sent a shockwave of calm crashing through my frantic nervous system. "Look at me," he commanded softly. I turned my head, my breath catching as I met his eyes. He was so close I could see the tiny flecks of gold swirling in the amber, the sharp, elegant cut of his cheekbones. "You are not going to fail," Conrad murmured, his thumb brushing a slow, deliberate line against my pulse point. "I am walking through those doors with you. I will not let a single person in that building look at you wrong, let alone stop you." I swallowed, the heavy, magnetic pull of his presence overriding every rational fear I had left. What if the police show up? A slow, devastating smirk pulled at the corner of his mouth. It was a terrifying expression, pure, unadulterated apex predator. "Then I will buy the police department before they can read us our rights," he rumbled. He dropped his hand from my neck, the sudden absence of his heat leaving me shivering. He reached for his door handle, popping it open to the chaotic noise of downtown Chicago. "Time to go to work, my lady," Conrad said. He stepped out onto the pavement. I took a deep breath, gripped my rubber gun, and followed him into the fire. Chapter 8. The heavy glass revolving doors of the downtown branch swallowed us whole. The interior was a cavern of polished marble, hushed whispers, and the sterile scent of old paper and ammonia. It felt like a mausoleum for money. I marched toward the center of the lobby, my boots squeaking painfully loud against the pristine floor. My heart hammered a frantic, deafening rhythm against my ribs. We hadn't even made it to the teller line before the sheer weight of what we were doing crashed into me. I pulled the matte black rubber pistol from the pocket of my leather jacket. My hands were shaking so badly I nearly dropped it on my own foot. "Nobody move!" I shrieked, my voice cracking humiliatingly on the last syllable. I aimed the plastic barrel at a very expensive-looking potted ficus near the entrance. "Put the money in the bag and don't be heroes!" I sounded less like a hardened criminal and more like a stressed substitute teacher on a disastrous field trip. Beside me, Conrad calmly adjusted the cuffs of his bespoke charcoal suit, looking utterly, devastatingly bored. He hadn't bothered to put on a mask, nor did he pull his jacket collar up. He just stood there, a towering monolith of tailored dominance, surveying the room as if he were deciding whether or not to purchase the building. "Cleo," he murmured, his tone entirely too calm for an active felony. "You are threatening the foliage. The plants do not have access to the vault." "I'm improvising," I hissed, lowering the toy gun and gesturing wildly toward the counter. "Watch the door. Look intimidating." "I am always intimidating," he replied, deadpan. Behind the thick, bulletproof glass partition, a pale teller's hand crept slowly, trembling, toward a red button hidden beneath the counter. The silent alarm. Conrad caught the microscopic movement instantly. He didn't pull a weapon. He didn't run. He didn't even raise his voice to a yell. He simply turned his head, his jaw ticking, and released a sound that shouldn't have been scientifically possible for a human being to make. "Everybody down." It wasn't a shout, it was a physical shockwave. The terrifying low-frequency acoustic force hit the room like a localized earthquake, rattling the glass partitions and vibrating the fillings in my teeth. It carried a heavy, invisible weight that practically forced the oxygen out of the room. The effect was absolute. The teller vanished behind the counter with a yelp. The elderly security guard by the entrance face planted into a velvet stanchion rope with a soft, peaceful thud. A delivery guy dropped a stack of cardboard boxes and curled into a tight, whimpering ball. Even a golden retriever waiting patiently by the ATMs flattened itself against the marble tiles, throwing its paws over its snout. I stood frozen, staring in horrified awe at the sea of compliant bodies. Conrad smoothly stepped over the softly snoring security guard, gesturing toward the heavy steel doors in the back corridor. "After you." I swallowed the lump of pure panic in my throat and followed him. But as the heavy vault door loomed ahead in the dim hallway, the deafening, undeniable wail of sirens suddenly erupted from the street outside. Chapter 9. The police sirens wailed in the distance, a high, panicked pitch that echoed off the marble walls and made my stomach completely bottom out. "Conrad!" I gasped, gripping the rubber gun so tightly my knuckles turned white. "The alarm! The police! We are going to federal prison!" "They are 3 minutes away," he replied smoothly, stopping in front of the massive 2-ton steel door of the main vault. "We only need 40 seconds. He didn't search for a keypad or demand a manager's override key. He wedged his fingers into the microscopic seam of the steel door and, with a terrifying groan of shifting metal, simply pulled it open with his bare hands. The vault was a chilling, silent cathedral of brushed steel and endless safety deposit boxes. Stacks of bundled $100 bills sat on a metal cart to our left, totaling more money than I could make in 3 lifetimes of selling orchids. Conrad didn't even glance at the cash. He moved directly down the center aisle to a row of brushed steel drawers labeled Unclaimed Property. Auction Holding. He traced his finger along the numbers, stopping at drawer 402. Gripping the handle, he applied a sharp, effortless pressure. With a terrifying crack of metal, he snapped the locking mechanism entirely off. He pulled out a flat, velvet-lined box and flipped it open. The fluorescent light caught the jewels instantly. There it was. My grandmother's necklace. 3 tiers of luminous, flawless pearls intertwined with sharp, glittering diamonds. The comedy of the lobby out front evaporated, replaced by a heavy, breathless silence. The air in the steel room suddenly felt too thick, too charged to breathe. Conrad lifted the delicate piece of jewelry from the velvet. He turned and stepped directly into my space, his massive frame crowding me against the wall of safe deposit boxes. He was so close I could feel the heavy, expensive fabric of his suit jacket brushing against my leather collar. "Turn around," he murmured, his voice a dark, rough vibration that settled directly at the base of my spine. I obeyed, my trembling hands dropping the rubber gun onto a nearby stack of cash. I turned my back to him, my breath hitching audibly in the quiet room as he swept my heavy, dark curls over my shoulder. His knuckles grazed the sensitive skin of my nape. I shivered violently. The cool metal of the necklace settled against my collarbone, but all I could focus on was the crushing, magnetic gravity of his massive hands resting heavily on my shoulders. "It belongs to you," Conrad whispered, leaning down until his lips were a fraction of an inch from my ear. His breath ghosted across my skin, sending a jolt of electricity straight to my core. "And no one takes what is yours, Cleo. Never again." He fastened the clasp. The heavy click echoed in the quiet vault, sounding less like a returned heirloom and entirely like a lock snapping shut on a cage. I turned to face him, my chest heaving, the diamonds heavy and cold against my racing pulse. I looked up into his eyes and realized, with a terrifying jolt of clarity, that he wasn't playing a game. The raw, possessive hunger in his stare wasn't a joke. He had orchestrated a felony just to see me wear it. Before I could speak, the sirens outside abruptly multiplied in volume, tires screeching to a chaotic halt directly in front of the bank's main entrance. Chapter 10. "Time to leave," Conrad stated, his expression completely unfazed by the flashing red and blue lights that began reflecting wildly through the high frosted windows of the corridor. He grabbed my hand. His grip was an iron vice, pulling me out of the vault, sprinting down a narrow, dimly lit maintenance corridor and slamming his shoulder through the heavy, reinforced fire exit door. We spilled out into the damp, narrow alleyway behind the bank. The cold Chicago air slapped my face, stinging my cheeks, but it did absolutely nothing to cool the raging adrenaline pumping through my veins. "Hey, stop right there! Police!" a voice shouted from the far mouth of the alley. Heavy boots pounded against the wet pavement. Conrad didn't hesitate. He yanked me behind a massive, rusted industrial dumpster, pressing me flush against the cold brick wall of the bank's exterior. He stepped in instantly, using his towering body as a complete physical shield. He caged me against the brick, one massive hand braced on the wall just above my head, the other resting heavily on my hip to keep me perfectly still. The flashing police lights painted the alley in frantic, sweeping bursts of red and blue, illuminating the sharp, ruthless angles of his face in the shadows. We were trapped in a space meant for one person. My chest was pressed completely flat against his solid, unyielding torso. I could feel the heavy, thundering rhythm of his heartbeat against my own. It was slow, methodical, entirely unbothered by the armed police officers sprinting past our hiding spot. I, on the other hand, was hyperventilating, struggling to draw oxygen into my panicked lungs. "Shh," he breathed, leaning his forehead down until it almost rested against mine. I couldn't speak if I wanted to. The physical proximity was completely overwhelming. The scent of him, dark spice, rain, and sheer intoxicating power, was suffocating. But it wasn't just his smell that was paralyzing me. It was the terrifying, unnatural stillness of him. He wasn't panting. He wasn't trembling with adrenaline. While my lungs were burning and my heart felt like it was going to shatter my ribs, his solid frame felt like it was carved directly from stone. I looked up, opening my mouth to ask how he was so calm, but the words died instantly on my tongue. In the dark shadows of the alley, Conrad's eyes had changed. They weren't just the striking amber I had seen in the flower shop. They were glowing. A feral, luminous gold pierced right through the darkness, tracking the movements of the officers in the street with a terrifying, predatory focus. A low, guttural vibration started deep in his massive chest, rumbling directly against my collarbone where the stolen diamonds rested. It wasn't a hum. It wasn't a sigh. It was a growl. My breath caught. My fingers, which had been pressed flat against his chest to push him away, slowly curled into the expensive fabric of his shirt. The billionaire CEO who had bought my debt, the man who wore bespoke suits and orchestrated corporate mergers from a glass tower, wasn't just a powerful man, he was a monster. And I was trapped in the dark with him. Chapter 11. The deadbolt sliding into place sounded like a gunshot in the quiet of my cramped third-floor apartment. I threw my damp leather jacket over a dining chair and dropped the rubber pistol onto my wobbly coffee table. It landed with a hollow plastic clatter. Conrad stood in the center of my tiny living room. He was a monolithic shadow of bespoke wool and radiating heat, his head practically grazing the frosted glass of my cheap ceiling fan. The sheer scale of his presence made the walls feel like they were rapidly shrinking inward. He smelled of rain, ozone, and an intoxicating dark spice that completely swallowed the scent of my vanilla candles. "You growled," I said, pointing a trembling, accusing finger directly at his chest. "In the alley, like an actual animal." Conrad calmly unbuttoned his suit jacket, completely unfazed by my impending breakdown. "Your respiratory rate was dangerously elevated, Cleo. I merely provided a grounding acoustic anchor to regulate your breathing." "A grounding acoustic?" I sputtered, pacing a tight circle on my frayed area rug. "Your eyes were glowing, Conrad, like high beams on a semi-truck. I saw them." He walked toward my kitchenette, casually inspecting a dying succulent on the counter. The human mind is highly susceptible to visual distortion during a severe adrenaline crash. It is a biological fail-safe. "Stop talking like a medical textbook," I yelled, throwing my hands up in the air. "You ripped a 2-ton steel bank vault open with your bare fingers." Conrad turned slowly to face me. The mask of the civilized billionaire slipped entirely, revealing the terrifying ancient composure beneath. He didn't offer a corporate excuse. He didn't deny it. "My pack enforcers are currently scrubbing the exterior security footage," he stated smoothly, his amber eyes locking onto mine with absolute, unblinking focus. "You will not be implicated in the breach." The air completely vanished from the room. I took a slow, staggering step backward, my spine hitting the edge of the kitchen counter. Your pack," I whispered, the words scraping against the sudden, icy terror rising in my throat. I had read the urban legends. Everyone knew the shifting underworld existed, but it was a myth kept far away from normal people. "My security personnel," he corrected softly, though the lie was entirely empty. He stepped closer, the suffocating, unnatural warmth of his body bleeding into the cold space between us. I held up a hand, bracing it flat against the solid wall of his chest to stop his advance. No, absolutely not. I am fiercely independent, Conrad. I don't do dominant, controlling billionaires, and I definitely do not do apex predators who think they can just claim me because they decided to buy my bank." His jaw tightened, a muscle leaping violently beneath his skin. "Cleo, you are entirely misinterpreting the biological dynamic." "Get out," I demanded, pointing rigidly toward the front door. Conrad stared down at me, the terrifying gravity of his presence completely overwhelming. He looked like he wanted to argue, to command, to tear the entire building down around us. Instead, he simply nodded, stepping backward into the hallway. "Lock the deadbolt," he ordered softly, and the door clicked shut. Chapter 12. At 2:45 in the morning, the silence in my apartment was deafening. I lay flat on my back, staring up at the water stain on my ceiling, entirely unable to sleep. My grandmother's heavy pearl and diamond necklace sat on top of my cheap particle board dresser. In the dim light of the street lamp filtering through my blinds, the jewels seemed to practically glow. It wasn't a comforting heirloom anymore. It felt like a tracking beacon. Every time I closed my eyes, I didn't see the safety of my bedroom. I saw the dark alleyway. I felt the crushing, suffocating heat of Conrad's massive frame pressed flush against mine. I heard that deep, involuntary growl vibrating against my collarbone. I was falling for a monster. A gorgeous, terrifyingly protective monster who could rip bank vaults open and silence a room with a single syllable. And that terrified me more than the threat of foreclosure ever could. If I stayed, I wouldn't just lose my flower shop. I would lose my entire identity to the sheer, overwhelming gravity of his world. I threw off the thin cotton blanket, my bare feet hitting the cold hardwood floor. Panic, cold and sharp, dictated my movements. I pulled a heavy canvas duffel bag from the back of my closet and began frantically stuffing it with whatever I could reach. Thick knit sweaters, faded denim, a pair of worn-out boots. I didn't care about folding. I just needed to put physical distance between myself and the terrifying magnetic pull of the alpha. I zipped the bag shut with a violent tug, the sound excessively loud in the quiet room. 20 minutes later, I was sitting in the back of a damp, rattling taxi, watching the neon lights of downtown Chicago blur past the rain-streaked window. The heater in the cab was broken, but I was shivering from an entirely different kind of cold. The kind that seeps into your bones when you know you are making a massive mistake. But you are too stubborn to stop. Union Station, I told the driver, handing him a crumpled wad of cash over the plastic partition. Keep the change. I stepped out into the freezing drizzle. The cavernous neoclassical architecture of the train terminal loomed over me like an ancient fortress. The massive stone columns and echoing grand hall were practically deserted at this hour, save for a few exhausted travellers and overnight janitorial staff. I hauled my heavy duffel bag over my shoulder, the canvas strap biting into my collarbone right next to where Conrad had fastened the diamonds hours earlier. I hadn't taken the necklace off. I couldn't bring myself to do it. I marched toward the ticketing kiosks, my boots clicking hollowly against the marble floors. I just needed a one-way ticket to anywhere. Seattle, Boston. It didn't matter. But as I approached platform 4, the hair on the back of my neck suddenly stood on end. A heavy, oppressive static filled the echoing air. I stopped walking. From the shadows of the concrete pillars, 3 massive, identically suited men stepped silently into my path. Chapter 13. They didn't look like standard train station security. They were built like offensive linemen, wearing immaculate dark suits that strained against the heavy, unnatural muscle of their shoulders. They moved with a synchronized, predatory grace that made my stomach completely drop. The pack enforcers. Conrad had tracked me. The man in the center stepped forward. He had a jagged scar cutting through his left eyebrow and hands that looked large enough to crush a cinder block. He didn't reach for a weapon, but the sheer, intimidating wall of his presence was a weapon all on its own. "Miss Cleo," he said. His voice was excessively polite, completely at odds with his terrifying appearance. "Mr. Voss politely requests that you do not board that train." I tightened my grip on the canvas strap of my duffel bag, planting my boots firmly on the concrete platform. "Is that right? Well, you can tell Mr. Voss that my travel plans are none of his business. Now move out of my way." I took a step forward, attempting to sidestep the wall of muscle. The enforcer smoothly shifted, blocking my path entirely. He raised a massive hand, his fingers hovering inches from my arm in a clear, unspoken warning. "We cannot allow you to leave the territory, ma'am. For your own safety." The absolute audacity of the statement snapped the last thread of my panicked restraint. I was not a piece of misplaced property to be managed. "Do not touch me," I yelled. Before his fingers could make contact, I twisted my torso, using the momentum to swing my heavy, overstuffed duffel bag like a medieval flail. The dense canvas, packed tightly with 3 pairs of boots and a hardcover botany textbook, connected squarely with the side of the enforcer's left knee. Crack. The massive shifter grunted, his knee buckling slightly as he staggered a half-step backward in sheer shock. The other two enforcers instantly tensed, a low, guttural warning vibrating in their throats, but they didn't dare attack me. They looked utterly horrified, realizing they had just been assaulted by a florist with a gym bag. I dropped the heavy duffel onto the platform with a loud thud, crossing my arms over my chest. "I am not going anywhere with you," I stated flatly, glaring at the three terrifying men. "I am not a package to be retrieved. If your alpha wants me to stay in this city, he can come down here and ask me himself." The scarred enforcer slowly straightened up, wincing as he shifted his weight off his bruised leg. He looked over my shoulder, all the colour suddenly draining from his tough, weathered face. "He doesn't have to," the enforcer whispered, immediately dropping his gaze to the concrete floor and exposing his throat in biological submission. Outside the terminal doors, the aggressive screech of heavy tires tore through the quiet night. A sleek, midnight black town car had just jumped the curb, violently parking in the pedestrian drop-off zone. The heavy glass doors of the station slid open. Conrad strode into the terminal, his long black trench coat billowing around his tailored suit. His raw, suffocating presence instantly silenced the echoing hall, and his glowing amber eyes locked entirely on me. Chapter 14. The cavernous architecture of Union Station seemed to shrink the moment Conrad stepped onto the platform. He didn't run. He didn't shout. His black trench coat billowed around his tailored suit as he walked, his leather shoes striking the concrete with a slow, measured cadence that echoed like a ticking clock. The three massive pack enforcers immediately stepped back, lowering their heads in absolute instinctual submission. Conrad stopped in front of me. His amber eyes swept over the heavy canvas duffel bag resting on the platform, then flicked to the enforcer awkwardly keeping his weight off his bruised knee. "Did she assault you, Marcus?" Conrad asked, his voice a low, terrifyingly calm rumble. The scarred enforcer cleared his throat, looking humiliated. "With a piece of luggage, sir. It was surprisingly heavy." Conrad turned his piercing gaze back to me. He didn't look angry. He looked profoundly, intensely fascinated. "You packed a geology textbook for a midnight escape?" "It's botany!" I snapped, my heart hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs. I crossed my arms tightly to hide the tremor in my hands. And it was a completely justified defensive maneuver. You can't just dispatch goons to collect me like I'm a missed package. "They were dispatched to ensure you did not board a train at 3 a.m, he corrected smoothly. "A highly illogical travel itinerary." "I am leaving, Conrad," I insisted, planting my boots firmly on the concrete. "I am fiercely independent and your entire world is terrifying, so tell your men to stand down because I will absolutely swing that bag again." Conrad didn't argue. He didn't try to logic his way through my panic. He simply stepped directly into my space, completely ignoring my rigid defensive posture. Before I could even register the movement, his massive hands gripped my waist. With a single, effortless motion, he lifted me completely off the ground. "Hey!" I shrieked, my hands instinctively flying out to grip his broad shoulders as the platform vanished beneath my feet. "Put me down!" "No," he stated simply. He adjusted his grip, pulling me flush against his chest so my boots dangled in the air. He smelled of rain, ozone, and an intoxicating dark spice. His physical presence was overwhelming, but his skin wasn't radiating the terrifying, unnatural heat I had expected. He was perfectly, steadily cool, a grounding anchor of solid muscle that instantly short-circuited my panic. "Put me down right now, or I will aggressively arrange flowers at you," I threatened, squirming against his hold. "A devastating tactical threat," Conrad murmured, entirely unbothered. He turned on his heel, carrying me away from the train tracks with the same casual ease as someone carrying a briefcase. "Conrad!" I pounded a fist against the heavy wool of his coat. "You are kidnapping me!" "I am relocating you," he countered, striding toward the glass exit doors while his enforcers silently trailed behind us. "Your apartment has terrible security, and I refuse to let my mate sleep in a room with a water-damaged ceiling." "It adds character," I yelled as the station doors slid open to the rainy street. He deposited me directly into the back seat of his idling town car, leaning in just close enough to trap my gaze with his glowing amber eyes. "We are going home, Cleo, and tomorrow we will establish your alibi." He slammed the door before I could ask what kind of alibi required kidnapping a florist. Chapter 15. The 82nd floor of the Voss Financial Tower was not an apartment. It was a sprawling, glass-walled fortress suspended in the Chicago skyline. I sat cross-legged on the edge of a massive, impossibly soft leather sofa, watching the rain lash against the floor-to-ceiling windows. I had absolutely refused the designer silk pajamas Conrad's staff had offered. Instead, I was drowning in one of his oversized white button-down dress shirts, the hem hitting just above my knees, the sleeves rolled up past my elbows. It felt like wearing a tent made of high thread-count cotton, but the fabric was saturated with his scent, and my traitorous biology found it incredibly soothing. Conrad sat on the opposite end of the vast sofa. He had discarded his suit jacket and tie, but his posture remained perfectly rigid and formal. He held a cardboard takeout container of cold lo mein, looking at the plastic fork in his hand like it was an alien artifact. "Do billionaires actually eat out of cardboard?" I asked, breaking the heavy silence. "Or is this some kind of immersive sociological experiment for you?" Conrad expertly twirled the noodles around the plastic tines. "I consume calories based on efficiency. This requires zero preparation and zero cleanup. It is a highly logical meal." "It's cold," I pointed out, stabbing a piece of broccoli in my own carton. "You refuse to let me microwave it," he replied, levelling a deadpan stare at me. "You stated that the radiation would, quote, ruin the structural integrity of the MSG." I snorted, a laugh escaping before I could suppress it. I was stalling, because I still haven't forgiven you for carrying me out of Union Station like a rolled-up rug. Conrad set his takeout container down on the sleek glass coffee table. The faint amusement vanished from his expression, replaced by that intense, unblinking gravity that made my stomach flip. "I will not apologize for preventing your departure," he stated, his low voice vibrating in the quiet penthouse. "But I recognize that my methods were an infringement on your autonomy." I paused, my plastic fork hovering in midair. It was the closest thing to an admission of guilt I had ever heard from the ruthless CEO. "You don't know how to do this, do you?" I asked softly, setting my own food aside. "You can command a boardroom and you can terrify an entire bank lobby, but you have absolutely no idea how to just be with someone." He looked at me, his amber eyes tracing the collar of his shirt where it slipped off my shoulder. The vulnerability in his stare was startling. "I have spent 3 centuries dealing entirely in leverage, Cleo," he murmured, the absolute honesty in his tone anchoring me to the spot. "I'm attempting to navigate a situation where my wealth and my authority are completely useless. It is a steep learning curve." I pulled my knees to my chest, the defensive walls around my heart finally beginning to crack. "So what is the plan, Voss? Am I your prisoner now?" "No," he said, standing up from the sofa. The sheer scale of him dominated the room, but he kept his distance, offering me space. "You are my equal, which is why tomorrow evening we are attending the Harrington Charity Gala." "A gala?" I blinked, completely thrown off balance. "Why?" Conrad buttoned the cuffs of his shirt, his expression shifting back into the calculating mastermind. "Because we robbed a bank yesterday, and the best way to prove you had nothing to do with it is to walk into a room full of detectives and politicians wearing the exact diamonds they are looking for." Chapter 16. The styling team vanished like ghosts the moment Conrad stepped into the master suite. I stood in front of the sweeping, gilded floor-length mirror, completely unable to recognize the woman staring back at me. The dress was a masterpiece of deep, emerald green silk. It clung tightly to my bodice before cascading down to the floor in heavy liquid folds, leaving my shoulders and collarbone entirely bare. I didn't look like a florist fighting for closure. I looked like I owned the city. Conrad approached from behind. He wore a flawless midnight black tuxedo, the stark tailoring emphasizing the terrifying breadth of his shoulders and the rigid, disciplined line of his posture. He moved silently, his reflection joining mine in the glass. He didn't say a word. He just stared at my reflection, his jaw tight, an intense, possessive darkness swirling in his amber eyes. "It's too much," I whispered, suddenly feeling entirely exposed. My hands trembled as I smoothed the silk over my hips. "I'm going to walk into a room full of billionaires and alphas, and they are going to know I don't belong there. They're going to see right through me." Conrad reached into the pocket of his tuxedo jacket. He pulled out the black velvet box we had stolen from the vault. "They will see exactly what I want them to see," he rumbled, his voice a low, commanding vibration that settled my frantic nerves. He opened the box and lifted my grandmother's diamond and pearl necklace. Stepping impossibly close, he reached around my neck. I held my breath. His skin was cool and steady, a grounding contrast to the nervous heat flushing my cheeks. He fastened the heavy platinum clasp at the nape of my neck. His knuckles lingered there for a fraction of a second, tracing the line of my spine with a deliberate, agonizing slowness. "You are not an imposter, Cleo," Conrad murmured, leaning down until his lips were inches from my ear. "You are the woman who looked a 300-year-old apex predator in the eye and assaulted him with a broom. You do not need their approval. You already own the room." I looked up, meeting his glowing gaze in the mirror. The heavy diamonds rested cold against my chest, but an entirely different kind of spark was catching fire in my veins. It was confidence. Pure, unadulterated defiance, borrowed directly from the terrifying man standing behind me. "And if someone asks where I got the necklace?" I asked, a slow, dangerous smile finally touching my lips. Conrad's eyes flashed with absolute lethal amusement. "You tell them the truth, you tell them you took it." He offered me his arm. The fabric of his tuxedo was rough, hiding the solid, unyielding muscle beneath. I slipped my hand into the crook of his elbow, letting him lead me out of the penthouse and down into the waiting town car. 20 minutes later, the massive, brass-studded doors of the Harrington estate loomed in front of us. The muffled sound of a string quartet and the low hum of the underworld's elite drifted through the heavy wood. Conrad looked down at me, his expression hardening into an impenetrable mask of power. "Ready, my lady?" I touched the stolen diamonds at my throat. "Open the doors, Conrad." The brass handles turned, the heavy doors swung inward, and a blinding wave of flash photography and hundreds of turning heads immediately locked onto us. Chapter 17. The heavy brass doors swung inward, and the Harrington Estate ballroom immediately assaulted my senses. The blinding, strobing bursts of flash photography erupted from the press line stationed in the grand foyer. I squinted against the harsh white light, my grip instinctively tightening on Conrad's arm as we stepped over the threshold. The physical space was a masterclass in opulent intimidation. Towering Corinthian columns stretched up to a vaulted ceiling frescoed with gold leaf, and massive crystal chandeliers hung suspended like frozen waterfalls of ice. But it wasn't the architecture that made the breath catch painfully in my throat. It was the people. The shifting underworld's elite was scattered across the sweeping marble floor, in pockets of dark, tailored silk and glittering diamonds. And the moment Conrad Voss stepped into the light, a ripple of biological recognition tore through the room. The low, sophisticated hum of conversation didn't just fade, it was violently severed. Even the string quartet situated on a raised dais in the corner seemed to stumble over their sheet music, the cellist dragging a discordant, screeching note across the strings before abruptly stopping altogether. Hundreds of heads turned, hundreds of eyes, some human, some catching the ambient light with an unnatural predatory gleam, locked directly onto us. Or, more accurately, they locked onto the blindingly brilliant multi-million-dollar stolen heirloom currently resting against my collarbone. "Conrad!" I whispered, barely moving my lips as a bead of cold sweat traced a path down my spine. "They are staring. Literally everyone is staring. I feel like a pork chop at a dog park. You are wearing a masterpiece, Cleo, he murmured, his voice a low, steadying vibration that hummed directly against my shoulder. Let them look. It is an educational experience for them. He didn't rush. He didn't pull me forward to escape the scrutiny. Instead, he forced a painstakingly slow, agonizingly deliberate pace as we began our descent down the grand, curving staircase into the main ballroom. Every step we took was a masterclass in psychological warfare. Conrad's physical proximity was the only thing keeping my knees from buckling. The rough, expensive wool of his tuxedo brushed continuously against the bare skin of my arm. He was an immovable, towering anchor of absolute certainty. He didn't project heat. His skin was cool and steady beneath my fingers, but the sheer gravitational weight of his presence acted as a physical shield against the crushing weight of the room's judgment. The man by the ice sculpture, I muttered out of the side of my mouth, forcing a rigid, terrified smile as we reached the bottom of the stairs. The one with the monocle who looks like a villain from a board game. He hasn't blinked in 40 seconds. He recognizes the necklace. That is Chief Inspector Vance, Conrad replied smoothly, seamlessly plucking 2 flutes of champagne from a passing waiter's silver tray without breaking his stride. He handed one to me. He oversees the Municipal Property Division. He is currently attempting to calculate how I bypassed a 2-ton steel vault without triggering a seismic alarm. I nearly dropped the crystal flute. You brought me to a party with the Chief Inspector of the Police Department, while wearing the evidence? It is the perfect alibi, Conrad countered, casually sipping his champagne as his glowing amber eyes swept the room, silently daring anyone to approach. No rational criminal would parade stolen goods in front of the investigating officer 24 hours after the breach. By wearing it openly, you render the truth entirely unbelievable. I took a desperate, entirely unladylike gulp of the champagne. The bubbles burned going down, but they provided a much-needed spark of artificial courage. You are a terrifying human being, Voss. I am not human, my lady, he reminded me softly, his gaze dropping to the heavy emerald silk draping over my hips. And right now, neither is the man marching directly toward us with a deeply inflated sense of his own authority. Brace yourself. I turned my head, following his line of sight. Cutting through the parted crowd of socialites was a man who looked like he had been poured into a silver-threaded tuxedo. He was tall, aggressively handsome in a sharp, reptilian sort of way, and possessed a slick, arrogant stride that made the hair on the back of my neck stand at absolute attention. The ambient chatter of the ballroom remained dead silent as he approached, the crowd eagerly anticipating a collision. "Who is that?" I asked, gripping the stem of my glass so tightly I feared the crystal might shatter in my hand. Conrad didn't shift his stance, but the solid muscle beneath his tuxedo jacket went entirely, terrifyingly rigid. That is Callum Ashford. He controls the Eastern Seaboard shipping syndicates, and he has been attempting to encroach on my territory for 2 financial quarters. Do not let him dictate the conversation. I argue with aggressive floral suppliers for a living, Conrad, I whispered back, lifting my chin and squaring my bare shoulders as the rival alpha closed the final few feet between us. I can handle a man in a shiny suit. Chapter 18. Callum Ashford stopped inches outside of what would be considered polite conversational distance. He was deliberately invading our personal space, an overt physical challenge masked beneath a veneer of high society etiquette. He smelled overwhelmingly of expensive cedar cologne and something metallic, like copper pennies left out in the sun. It was a sharp, grating contrast to the clean, intoxicating scent of rain and dark spice that always clung to Conrad. "Boss?" Callum drawled, his voice a smooth, calculated purr that immediately set my teeth on edge. He didn't offer a hand to shake. He just stood there, exuding a sleazy corporate arrogance. "I heard a rumor you were spiraling into eccentric hobbies, but I never imagined you would stoop to bringing a fragile little human to a pack function. How delightfully avant-garde of you." He didn't even look at Conrad. Callum's pale blue eyes were entirely fixed on me, dragging a slow, insolent gaze from the hem of my emerald gown, up the curve of my waist, and finally locking onto the stolen diamonds resting at my throat. "And wearing the municipal bank's missing inventory, no less," Callum added, a cruel, mocking smirk twisting his lips. "Tell me, sweetheart, did he buy you with those, or are you just holding the evidence until the police arrive?" My heart slammed against my ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage. The sheer predatory weight of Callum's attention was designed to make me cower, to force me to look at the floor in biological submission. Instead, a hot, vicious spark of defensive anger ignited in my chest. I had spent the last 3 years fighting off corporate landlords, arrogant bank managers, and a system designed to crush me. I was not about to be intimidated by a glorified mobster who bought his suits off the rack. I didn't wait for Conrad to defend me. "The only thing fragile in this conversation is your incredibly dated concept of intimidation, Mr. Ashford," I said, my voice ringing out clear and sharp in the painfully quiet ballroom. Callum blinked, his arrogant smirk faltering for a fraction of a second. He clearly hadn't expected the fragile human to speak, let alone insult him. He took a deliberate, aggressive step forward, crowding me so closely I could see the pores on his nose. "You have a sharp tongue for someone who doesn't belong here," Callum sneered, leaning down to whisper directly into my face. "You should learn to lower your eyes when an alpha is speaking, little girl, before you get yourself—" He didn't get to finish the threat. My hand moved purely on instinct. I gripped the crystal flute of champagne and forcefully shoved the rim directly into the center of Callum's silver-threaded chest. The delicate glass didn't break, but the impact was hard enough to make him stumble backward with a sharp gasp. A wave of sticky, expensive vintage champagne sloshed over the rim, completely saturating the lapel of his immaculate tuxedo. "Oops," I deadpanned, holding the half-empty glass in the air between us like a physical barricade. My hand slipped. I suppose my human motor skills are just entirely unreliable. "Back off, before I spill the rest of it on your shoes." A collective, horrified gasp echoed across the ballroom. Callum looked down at the massive, spreading stain on his chest, his pale eyes flashing with a sudden, violent rage. His upper lip curled back, exposing a set of teeth that suddenly looked far too sharp to be human. He lunged forward, his massive hand snapping up to grab my wrist. He never made it. Conrad didn't pull me behind him. He didn't shield me like a weak, helpless damsel. Instead, he stepped smoothly to my side, his massive shoulder perfectly aligning with mine, creating an impenetrable, towering wall of solidarity. And then, Conrad Voss unleashed the most terrifying sound I had ever heard in my entire life. It wasn't a shout. It wasn't a roar. It was a low-frequency, guttural growl that started deep within the cavernous expanse of his chest and rolled outward like a physical shockwave. It bypassed my ears entirely, vibrating directly in the marrow of my bones. The acoustic force of the warning was absolute. The crystal chandeliers above us shuddered, emitting a high, synchronized chime. 3 trays of champagne glasses on a nearby catering table violently shattered, raining fine dust onto the marble floor. Callum Ashford froze in mid-lunge, his hand hovering inches from my wrist. The colour completely drained from his face, leaving him looking sickly and pale under the harsh lighting. The sheer, dominating violence radiating from Conrad forced the rival alpha to take a slow, staggering step backward, his eyes dropping instantly to the floor in undeniable biological submission. "You are crowding her," Conrad stated. The words were quiet, but they carried the weight of a death sentence in the silent room. "And I find your lack of spatial awareness deeply offensive." "Conrad!" Callum choked out, his voice trembling slightly as he stared at the marble tiles between my boots. "I was merely—" "You will apologize to my Luna," Conrad interrupted, the title dropping like a heavy iron anvil into the center of the ballroom. The entire underworld elite sucked in a collective breath. The bank stunt, the diamonds, the public appearance, it all suddenly made terrifying sense to them. I wasn't a pet. I wasn't a pawn. I was the alpha's equal. Callum swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing nervously. He kept his eyes strictly on the floor. "My deepest apologies, ma'am. It was a misunderstanding." Conrad didn't acknowledge the apology. He simply turned his head, his glowing amber eyes locking onto mine with an intensity that made the rest of the room completely vanish. "Are you finished with your champagne, Cleo?" he asked calmly, as if we were discussing the weather. "Yes," I breathed, my hand shaking as I handed the half-empty flute to a completely petrified waiter standing nearby. "Excellent," Conrad murmured, offering me his arm once again. "The air in here has become terribly stale. Let's go home." Chapter 19. The ride away from the Harrington estate was completely devoid of conversation, but the silence inside the massive town car was anything but peaceful. It was heavy, thick with a lingering adrenaline that made every nerve ending in my body feel like it was humming at a dangerous frequency. I stared out the tinted window, watching the neon blur of the Chicago skyline gradually give way to the dark, winding roads of the forested suburbs. The diamonds at my throat felt incredibly heavy. The reality of what had just happened in that ballroom was slowly catching up to me. Conrad had publicly declared me as his Luna. He had effectively drawn a line in the sand, daring the most dangerous predators in the city to cross it. And he had done it all while letting me hold my own ground. He hadn't fought my battle. He had simply been the immovable mountain standing behind me while I fought it myself. The town car finally slowed, tires crunching over a long sweeping gravel driveway. We pulled up to a sprawling ultra-modern estate constructed entirely of dark steel and massive panes of architectural glass, nestled deep within a dense private forest. The driver didn't even park before Conrad popped his door open and stepped out into the crisp night air. He walked around the rear of the vehicle, opening my door and offering his hand. I took it, stepping out onto the gravel. The contrast between this place and my chaotic, humid flower shop couldn't have been more extreme. This was a fortress of isolation, a place designed for a man who spent his life carrying the weight of a financial empire and an ancient, hidden society. Conrad didn't lead me toward the sleek, illuminated double doors of the main house. Instead, he guided me down a winding slate path that snaked around the side of the property, disappearing into a dense thicket of towering oak trees. "Where are we going?" I asked, pulling the heavy silk of my emerald gown up slightly to avoid dragging it across the damp stones. "Somewhere you will find more agreeable than a sterile penthouse," he replied quietly. We emerged from the trees into a wide, secluded clearing, my breath caught in my throat. Standing in the center of the clearing was a massive, Victorian-style botanical conservatory. It was an architectural marvel of curved glass and wrought iron, glowing from within with a soft, warm amber light that spilled out onto the surrounding lawn. Conrad pushed open the heavy iron doors, and a wave of thick, humid air washed over us. The scent was intoxicating, a rich, earthy blend of damp soil, blooming jasmine, and crushed eucalyptus. The interior of the glass retreat was a sprawling, untamed jungle, vastly different from the meticulously manicured lawns outside. Massive ferns brushed against the glass walls, and thick vines of ivy spiraled up the iron support columns toward the vaulted ceiling. It felt exactly like Petal Wreck, only magnified 1,000 times over. It was a chaotic, beautiful sanctuary, hidden right in the middle of a billionaire's sterile fortress. I walked slowly down the central stone pathway, trailing my fingers over the broad, waxy leaves of a monstera plant. "Conrad, this is incredible. I had no idea you kept a hothouse." "I don't," he admitted, his voice sounding entirely different in the humid, acoustic space. It lacked the sharp, commanding edge of the boardroom or the gala. Here it was just a low, exhausted rumble. "It was constructed for the previous owner. I have never found a use for it. Until now." I turned around. Conrad was standing near the entrance, and the terrifying, impenetrable armor of the Billionaire Alpha was actively dismantling before my eyes. He reached up, pulling the perfectly tied black silk bow tie loose and tossing it carelessly onto an iron bench. Next went the expensive tuxedo jacket, the heavy wool sliding off his broad shoulders and joining the tie. He stood there in his crisp white dress shirt, undoing the top 3 buttons to expose the strong, corded column of his throat. He looked physically exhausted, the rigid posture he maintained all evening finally slumping just a fraction. He ran a massive hand through his perfectly styled hair, ruining the neat lines and leaving it falling messily across his forehead. Without the expensive tailoring, without the terrifying public displays of power, he just looked like a man. A dangerously attractive, hopelessly overwhelmed man. He walked slowly down the stone path toward me, the sheer size of his frame dwarfing the delicate foliage around us. He stopped 2 feet away, the intense heat of his body cutting through the damp humidity of the room. "You did not flinch tonight," Conrad observed, his amber eyes dropping to the diamonds resting against my bare collarbone. "When Ashford threatened you, your pulse did not spike with fear. It spiked with aggression." "I told you," I whispered, the air suddenly feeling entirely too thin to breathe. "I am fiercely independent. I don't need a billionaire to fight my battles." "I am acutely aware of that," he murmured, his gaze lifting to meet mine. The unblinking predatory focus was gone, replaced by a raw, startling vulnerability that anchored me completely to the spot. He took a half-step closer, entirely invading my personal space. The scent of him, rain and ozone, mixed perfectly with the earthy smell of the conservatory. "You do not need my money, Cleo," Conrad said, his voice dropping into a rough, quiet register that vibrated directly against my ribs. "You do not need my protection. You do not need my influence to reclaim your property." He reached out, his knuckles brushing lightly against the edge of my jaw, sending a violent shiver racing down my spine. "Which leaves me," he breathed, his thumb tracing the line of my lower lip, "with a terrifying logistical problem." "A logistical problem?" I managed to squeak out, my voice entirely betraying the confident front I had held all night. "I didn't realize I was a supply chain issue, Voss." A faint, devastatingly tired smile touched the corners of his mouth. "You are an anomaly. In chess, there is a position called Zugzwang. It occurs when a player is obligated to make a move, but every available move puts them at a severe disadvantage." His thumb slipped from my lip, his hand wrapping warmly around the curve of my neck. "If I attempt to provide for you with my wealth," Conrad continued, his gaze searching mine, "you throw a spiked cactus at my chest. If I attempt to protect you using my pack, you assault my lead enforcer with a canvas bag full of textbooks. I cannot intimidate you. I cannot buy you. I am entirely out of strategic maneuvers." I stared at him, the humid air of the conservatory settling around us like a heavy blanket. The ruthless billionaire, the terrifying apex predator who had just brought a rival alpha to his knees with a single sound, was standing in a greenhouse admitting utter defeat. "So, what is your next move?" I whispered, my hands instinctively reaching up to rest flat against the crisp cotton of his unbuttoned shirt. I could feel the steady, thundering rhythm of his heart beneath the fabric. "I surrender," he said simply. He let out a long, shuddering breath, resting his forehead against mine. "I am completely terrible at this, Cleo. I am so unequipped to handle you that I actually authorized the acquisition of the downtown municipal bank branch on Tuesday morning." I blinked, my brain screeching to a violent halt. I pulled my head back just enough to look him in the eye. You bought the bank? The bank we robbed?" "Yes," Conrad admitted, not a shred of remorse in his glowing amber eyes. "The paperwork cleared 3 hours before we walked into the lobby." "Conrad!" I shoved at his chest, though it was exactly like pushing a brick wall. "Are you telling me I committed a felony with a rubber gun to steal my own grandmother's necklace from your vault?" "Technically," he corrected, completely deadpan, "you removed your own property from your own vault. Since I placed the deed to the building entirely in the name of Petal Wreck." My jaw dropped. "You put a multi-million-dollar financial institution in the name of my failing flower shop." "It seemed like a sound diversification of your assets." A bubble of hysterical, uncontainable laughter burst out of my chest. It echoed off the glass panels of the conservatory, loud and chaotic. I laughed until tears pricked the corners of my eyes, the sheer brilliant absurdity of the man standing in front of me, washing away every last ounce of my fear. He hadn't orchestrated a heist to show off his power. He had orchestrated a ridiculous high-stakes fake robbery because he knew I needed to feel like I had fought for my legacy, even if he had secretly rigged the game so I couldn't possibly lose. "You are a ridiculous, insane man," I gasped, shaking my head. "I am hopelessly mated to a woman who yells at foliage," he countered smoothly, his massive hands sliding down to grip my waist. I didn't hesitate. I grabbed the lapels of his white dress shirt, twisted the expensive fabric in my fists, and pulled him down to me. The moment our lips met, the earth seemingly tilted on its axis. The kiss wasn't a gentle, tentative exploration, it was a collision. Conrad let out a ragged, desperate breath, his arms wrapping around my back and lifting me flush against his solid frame. The cool, steady reality of his touch grounded the chaotic adrenaline in my veins. I tasted expensive champagne and dark spice, entirely consumed by the crushing gravitational pull of his presence. Deep within his chest, a sound began to build. It wasn't the terrifying, weaponized roar from the bank lobby or the gala. This was a low, involuntary, continuous vibration of pure, unadulterated satisfaction. The deep, guttural growl hummed against my collarbone, reverberating straight through the stolen diamonds and into my skin. But the acoustic force didn't just vibrate between us. All around us in the quiet, humid glasshouse, the low-frequency resonance swept through the heavy air. I pulled back, gasping for breath, my hands still tangled in his messy hair. "Conrad?" I whispered, my eyes widening. I looked over his shoulder. The tightly coiled buds of a massive night-blooming jasmine bush nearest to us were shivering. As the heavy, rumbling vibration of his growl lingered in the damp air, the white petals rapidly, prematurely unfurled, blooming violently into existence. A wave of sweet, intoxicating fragrance crashed over us, soon followed by the rustling of exotic lilies and orchids popping open in a chaotic, synchronized cascade of color along the iron trellis. Conrad looked around the blooming conservatory, then slowly dropped his gaze back to my mouth, looking entirely unfazed by the botanical anomaly his vocal cords had just caused. "I suppose," he murmured, his thumb brushing my swollen lower lip. "I finally found a logical way to help with your inventory." I laughed, pulling the terrifying, brilliant billionaire back down to me, knowing with absolute certainty that I would never have to fight a battle alone again.